This is Lian Li's new B4 M8TX, and let's just say there were a few things about this case that ended up surprising me. Welcome to Machines More. I am a PC enthusiast and content creator. Here on this channel, I cover many of my interests, and I'm always happy to share with you about new ways to make your PC build and experience more exciting. So I'd be very honored if you would make sure that you're subscribed with that bell on for notifications and give this video a like here. All right, this is the new Lian Li B4 M8TX, and we saw this one at Computex. I've covered it a few times during its development, and I will say it's one thing to look at a case based on paper specs, and it's a complete different thing to build in it, use it, live it type of thing. I will make it clear now, I don't dislike this case. I think it does a lot for the money, and it'll be good for a specific type of user. Perhaps some of my feedback will be construed as negative. Some of it is in fact constructive criticism, but the bulk of it, my main intent after testing it extensively is just to highlight who it's ideal for. It'll be geared more towards a specific type of user who is not my expectation initially, and that's what much of this review is going to clarify. Big thanks to Lian Li for providing the test sample for the purposes of review. This is not a paid review though, and I'm free to share my feedback with you. They won't have advance notice of any of these findings either. This is available to them at the same time you see it. Okay, the B4 M8TX is a 21.3 liter case. It's developed in conjunction with Dan cases, just like the A4H2O and A3 M8TX were. It is quite a long case with the spec at 407 millimeters. For reference, the A3 M8TX, which is the next step up in Lian Li's MFF lineup, that is 443 millimeters long. And cases M3 is only 366 millimeters long for reference as well. I do want to be clear, the 407 is the box part of it. You notice at the back of the case there are some 12 millimeter protrusions, and these are fixed feet for when the case is turned vertically. And this does potentially add some footprint. It's also 191 millimeters wide and 287.5 millimeters tall, and that number will include the roughly 13 millimeter tall feet. But the volume spec is derived from the box portion of the unit. It's 191 by 275 by 407. So based on my build experience, which I'll touch on in a bit, it feels more cramped, like a sub 20 liter case, and part of that is because the back has a deep, almost 32 millimeter recess here, where you see, you'll see where that's where the motherboard and the GPU's I/O sits, and that's to accommodate the case when it's turned in vertical mode, where your I/O and your cables would go. So if this case didn't have this recess here, it actually would be a lot closer to 19 point something liters, give or take. GPUs up to 358 millimeters are okay. You can go up to 4 slots, but do be cautioned that not all M8TX boards have the primary slot in the highest position. Some do drop down 1 slot, so that may limit your GPU thickness if you go with an M8TX board. This is a simple steel case. There's no exotic materials. It takes up to an M8TX board, which would take up the entire height of the insides, but it can also fit an ITX board if you want. One of the headline specs is the price. $70 US for the black, $75 for the white. And there are some wood options, wood panel options that add $15. Suffice to say, this is a budget-oriented case, so you don't get much in the way of material quality or bells and whistles. It's just really boxy, hard square edges all around. The panels do have a specific way to come off. They are toolless, but in order to remove the side panels, you'd have to unlatch the front panel first, and that unlocks by shifting up. And at the front, you'll see there's a spot for a 2.5-inch SSD, a spot for a 120 millimeter fan that the side panels can unlatch out. They have sliding catches, and it's one way, so you can tell which way to go in. The thick side goes at the back, and the thinner end at the front. The top panel just opens up to the fan area. The case does include 2 slim 120 millimeter fans that are pre-installed at the top. You cannot access much from the top except by removing this fan panel, and then you have this little window here to get some headers, cables, and that sort of thing sorted out. And your bottom panel here, that's going to be fixed in place, but it is covered by a removable dust filter. After removing that, it is semi-open at the bottom. You do have space here for 3 120mm fans. There's also cutouts for 140mm fans at the bottom if you would rather fit 2 of those instead. And at the bottom, there are also cutouts for a 2.5-inch SSD or one 3.5-inch HDD. Can take up to 140mm long ATX PSU, which is increasingly rare because of the higher wattages these days. But if you have or can get one, you can fit that with your power connectors facing the main board side. It's kind of an odd position, both from a build and a future maintenance perspective. I do think that length spec will be a little bit limiting. You can also do an SFX power supply with a separate bracket. The power supply connectors will just face down like I have here, and you're just gonna have to remove the cage that you're not using because you do get 2 cages pre-installed. As I mentioned, you do have these feet at the back. You can take off that plastic shroud. It does look very odd without it though, so that is something to keep in mind. These are for rotating the case into a vertical position. In that mode, you will have your front panel I/O facing forward like this, and then the fans exhausting towards the user. And the reason for the big recess at the rear I/O end of the case is so that users can adopt this mode. The AC power connector also swivels for that reason. In vertical mode, this can tuck the power connector or the power cable away so it doesn't get in the way. And in horizontal mode, you can choose to have it extended, but actually right now, like I have it, it actually won't flip out because there's too much cable in here. That's not going to be appropriate to do that. So if I try to bend this guy out right now, I'm almost certain this tab is going to snap off. So that's something you have to be aware of. You'll also notice some cable management add-ons here at the back. These will help secure your display cable for that vertical mode or that power cable, anything else you don't want moving out of the way. If you are looking to deploy this case in vertical mode, which is where I think the real forte of this case design is, you can option on the vertical AeroDeck. It is crafted with wood, so the white one has the beech wood, the black one has more of a walnut type of wood striping on the front, and it is gonna make this case a little bit better suited for running in that vertical mode. It relocates the front I/O to the top of the unit instead of being at the front and visible, and allows you to put your fans in that compartment instead of only in the case. Of course, you could do it either way. You could just use it as a cosmetic panel if that's what you wanted, but it latches in pretty seamlessly into the bottom. So the bottom of your case now becomes your front, and the previous top of your case becomes the back of the case. So it'll intake at the front and exhaust out the back. That would be most reasonable there. It does add some volume to the case, but like I mentioned, if you are running this or thinking about running this in the vertical mode, then this does make it a little bit more of a complete looking case. For front I/O, you do have 2 USB-A, a USB-C, HD audio, and a power button. All right, so for other fans, we talked about the ones at the bottom and the top. You do have a bracket at the back for a 120mm fan. This is kind of a unique piece. In the standard position, it sits pointing outwards, it's protruding out the back, mainly to make space for the end of a 360mm radiator to slot into. You can flip this around and flip it inwards. This would mainly be for a scenario where you're using a tower cooler in conjunction with an M.2 board, where that socket's going to be in a more central position, and you want to get a back fan closer to the cooler. So I tried it with my air-cooled build and a mini-itx board here, and it was just too tight. But you don't really get any meaningful space savings by flipping it inwards. The bracket in default will protrude here, but it's actually still behind where these feet are going to be. Speaking of tower coolers, the max spec is 162mm with this fan bracket in place, and 168 without it. That will allow for plenty of big options. The main purpose of this side fan bracket is for a radiator, although you could certainly use it to place up to 3 120mm or 2 140mm fans in conjunction with your air cooler. Now, directly over the air cooler is not going to happen unless you have a low tower cooler or or a top-down cooler. For liquid cooling, the singular mounting point for a radiator would be here at the side. You can go up to 360 millimeter in 120 millimeter increments, or a 280 millimeter, or I guess 140. The headline spec here is, of course, that 360 millimeter radiator capability, which is very unique in this size bracket. There's one other small case that I'm going to be doing a built-in soon, which can also do 360. Nonetheless, a 360 in a case of this volume is a very special feature. That being said, it does create a set of unique challenges as well. It will require the use of the SFX power supply, and even then you still only have about 57 millimeters of space over the power supply here. The airflow is essentially cut off in front of the radiator right here, and it makes the build experience rather uncomfortable. On the topic of build experience, I first started out with this case by doing a 360 millimeter radiator equipped build. Here, the build features a 9950X 3D on MSI's MAG B850M Mortar mini-itx motherboard, equipped with 32 gigs of 6000 MHz DDR5. I'm using BiWin's new 1TB M560 Gen 5 SSD. It's a new mid-range Gen 5 M.2 drive, very low power, and still fairly fast at up to 11,000 read or write speeds, 11,000 megabytes per second. You should be able to get this soon. I'm not sure about the exact availability. I also used Lian Li's white SP1000 SFX power supply. SFX is required if you want a 360 millimeter radiator. And I have the Asus Prime 5080, which is the same GPU that I use for both air and liquid cooled build. And then I added two Noctua fans underneath the GPU to help with airflow. These are the A12x25 G2s, and I use the same ones for both the liquid cooled and the air cooled build. In many cases, the build order can be a little flexible, but if you're building with 360 in this case, it gets very rigid. And what I did was I built up the motherboard outside the case, placed the board into the case, which can be a little bit challenging given that the board pretty much fits exactly into the entire internal dimension here, the height of the case. In hindsight, I could have taken out the top fan panel a little bit earlier just to make things more accessible. And then you'll connect up the cables from the case and the power supply. And then I screwed down the board, flipped the case over, and then from the other side, I inserted the power supply. Now that is going to be easiest to connect up the AC cable at this point from this side, and potentially the other power supply cables coming from this side. The tricky part is fitting the 360. So I used Noctua's new 360 millimeter AIO, which is going to be best in class. That thickness is at 57 millimeters, so it's not extraordinary in terms of the thickness, though. Plenty of units will land in that 54 to 57 millimeter range, and that means, of course, over the power supply, it's very, very tight. And you do want the rad ports to slot into the gap here between the power supply and the front of the case. That's why there's a gap there, I think. The length of the rad is pretty much the entire length of the internal dimension here. And since you can't remove any of these vertical members or any of the front or bottom panels, whatever, to slide it in, you do have to angle one end in first and then tilt it, wiggle it into place. And for that reason, I ended up choosing to install the fans on the outside of the radiator, simply because having this power supply here means you can't easily tilt or maneuver the full thickness with the fans in, and you'd have to, pre-install the fans. Now you could potentially withdraw the power supply if you wanted the fans on the inside of the case, but then note that your rad will block off all access to the cabling and everything, so if something were to go wrong or get in the way of the fans, you'll have to undo everything just to adjust those. So I think fans on the outside, it's going to be safest. At this point, you can then attach the panel to the fan and then the radiator. I didn't have access to the outermost two fan holes, though. And then attach that panel to the case. So tightly it fits together. There really is practically no room between the radiator and the power supply, though. And then I chose to install the GPU last because that being there could potentially make the radiator difficult to position as well. So while this card and this thickness was relatively okay to install, if you have a longer or thicker card, it will be tricky because the radiator is already in place and you can't just pull the panel out at this point. So if you're doing a 360 millimeter build, be basically prepared for some trouble. And this entire time doing this, I couldn't help but think that someone newer to PC building would find this very overwhelming or very frustrating, because I personally really dislike the experience of fitting the 360 in place, and after all that you still have an obstructed rad, right? And I just calculated it. You lose about 63.5 square centimeters, essentially the side surface area of the SFX power supply, and at least about 369 square centimeters. And you know what'll give you more than that? It's a 280 millimeter rad, which gives you 392 square centimeters, which will fit in here with less drama. So there are also a few stray screws and an extra bracket that I ended up having to loosen up and remove because they would, seemingly impede the radiator. And even then, it was so tight that I managed to scratch the radiator with some stray screws here. It's not a biggie for performance, but this is really going to annoy some folks. So probably the best piece of advice that I can offer based on my experience is don't do the 360 millimeter build unless you really can't find a good 280 to work with. Or I guess, if you want to do this Nocto, there's no 280, right? So that could be one reason. Later on, I did switch to a mini-itx board like you see here, and I did a similar build like what I did in the NCase M3 build before, and this was with a Gigabyte Z890i and a 285K, and I used Nocto's D15 G2 Chromax paired with a rear panel fan here, just an A12 by 25 G2, also at the front. And I had these two same bottom fans here. The experience was a little bit better, namely the board went right in. I didn't have to worry about fitting a long radiator, but the build experience still could have been a little bit better. For one, the power supply is just in this really weird spot now, and I really wanted it to be either all the way at the front right here, or be able to sit flat next to the ITX board, but you can't. There's one position, and you also have limited access from the top, so that once you arrange cables and then replace the top fan panel, it's very possible to have some cables hit the fan, which happened to me. So you'd have to remove that, adjust, reattach, and I had to do this quite a few times because it's just so tight up here. And the cable management at the top is just so, it's very tight. So the biggest impediment was not being able to just fully remove this top panel, yank it off, or the bottom panel, or the front panel during the build. And it just makes the build experience highly dependent on the size of your components fitting in nicely, as well as your cables being able to tuck away out of the way. Also, the top pivoting AC power connector here will require you just to have the right amount of cable slack dialed in, and this is a little bit challenging to adjust after the fact because there's so much stuff up here. So overall, while doing an ITX build with an air cooler, it was a little bit more relaxed. I still didn't find the build experience particularly enjoyable compared to similar layout cases such as the NR200 or the NCase M3, and both of those are actually smaller than this, but they don't feel as limiting, and this I think would be a biggie for new builders to be aware of. So let's start with thermal performance for the 360 liquid cooled build. With a bigger radiator and a CPU heavy test, you do expect the temps to be good, and they are. Here the fans can top out at 1500 RPM, and the 9950X 3D is only at 78 degrees, which I would consider quite good. My initial build was rad fans as intake. Flipping the fans around to exhaust did not make much of a difference, so if you want to run it that way to slightly favor GPU temps, which I'll show you next, just know that there's not much of an impact if you do that on CPU only thermals. In a combined scenario with 1440p gaming, the temps for my test suite here do end up being quite acceptable, but what was concerning to me was the fan speeds that are required to achieve those temps. So for one, the GPU had to hit 2570 RPM, which is 84% of what these GPU fans can run at. And needless to say, it's very loud. The rad fans also needed to hit 1400 RPM to get to 74 degrees. That's 3 fans, right? Now, if you do flip the fans to exhaust, you do improve slightly on the GPU side, but you run similarly warmer on the CPU. So, that's a trade-off that's not great exactly either way. So my impression here is that in this build mode, you really do start seeing the problem with filling this space with a big radiator, choking that radiator off of this power supply, having a limited number of case fans to aid your airflow, because you do limit these options with the big rad. Now, flipping the case to vertical mode is quite easy. You just stand it up on the legs like I showed you earlier. In that scenario, you don't see much of a change to the CPU temps. We don't expect there to be, but the combined temps do actually see a bit of boost in the GPU department. So I think what's happening here is with the case standing up, the GPU panel of the case can breathe more freely because it's not at the bottom, And despite having case fans there to help, having no obstructions is ultimately better than having that slim space of 13 millimeter or so there, right? Because of how high the GPU fans have to run in order to achieve what I would consider semi-decent temps, though, I can't recommend running a particularly power-hungry GPU like the 5080 in this type of build mode. I just think having a rad right here directly between the top exhaust, the exit point for the GPU's exhaust, that really chokes things off. So you do need to be careful with your GPU selection for that particular build configuration. Now, switching over to the air-cooled build and a different CPU, so don't compare the CPU temps between the liquid-cooled and this one, but I built this way to be directly comparable to the Ncase M3 build I've done previously. The M3 build differed in that I had full thickness top fans and no fans under the GPU. With the 285K in Blender, heavy load, it's actually okay. The fans are almost full power, but there's still some headroom left, and they're very similar to the M3, so a little bit better, actually. What's interesting is the gaming temps. Now, compared to what I saw with the AIO results, right away I was seeing better GPU temps. Same GPU here, temps are lower, but the key is that this is only at 1865 RPM on the GPU fan. So same power consumption here, so they are comparable, but you can tell right away the noise is completely different. The CPU temps are a lot more elevated with the B4. Not that this level is concerning, but strictly speaking, the airflow as far as minimizing GPU's impact on CPU cooling, the M3 is absolutely better. And as mentioned, the M3 had full thickness top exhausts, and one of the things with the M3 is you have a lot of flexibility to shift that ITX board up or down. There I could locate the board to the perfect location and delegate the space to whatever I want. I could put fans up top. With the B4, you just can't do that. You're stuck with these slim fans here. They're often going to be too tight. You can't lower anything here. You can't invert the case. Even though there is actually plenty of space, as you can see here with an ITX board. So I do think building with a tower cooler, big tower cooler, will get you better results. A little surprising based on what I thought initially when I first saw the case, right? Because like 360's got to be better. But you can see it's just more open here, and things just breathe a lot better in this layout. Pros of the case. Well, I think you can't ignore the price. It does hit a price point that's attractive at a time when build components are elevated. And I think that many will find that a plus, right? The quality is as expected for a budget steel case. It's really not terrible. The top, side, and front panels feature a fine mesh filter, and that is good that it's built in. The hardware, the screws, they come with this, nice organizer, this complete front panel I/O here. But the price point also means that even little things like the included screws feel as you might expect. They're very low cost feeling. Now, it does provide an alternate orientation in the vertical mode. I think that's a plus, and some users may find that attractive. And I think so much of this case was designed to accommodate that mode, such as the recess here at the bottom means you don't need 90-degree cables, the fixed feet here at the back, the swiveling power connector that it can tuck away. So if you want to do a vertical case, I actually think you'll find this to be quite a good option. I think it ends up being a better vertical case than it is a horizontal case. However, the flip side of that, and the cons here, unfortunately, I do have a lot of concerns. I think the design made a lot of compromises in order to get that vertical option. Lian Li told me they expect the vast majority of users to actually deploy this in horizontal mode, so that they compromise so much to favor vertical use is quite surprising to me. So as mentioned, the recess at the back, which is almost a necessity for the vertical mode, made using the case quite annoying in horizontal mode. So like in order to plug something in here, at the back, you do have to squeeze your hand into this recess. I don't have particular big fat fingers, but even I thought that accessing the small plugs accurately was very inconvenient. In fact, because of that, I just opted to use the front panel I/O a lot instead of reaching back here and kind of, contorting my hands. And so it sacrifices for a mode that you perhaps couldn't care less about. You just have this vestigial tail of these back feet that you can't get rid of without a saw. And as mentioned, it really builds like a sub 20 liter case, because in reality, the internal dimensions are much more akin to a sub 20 liter case. The extra volume is coming from here. And so, yeah, the build experience with this is actually quite ho-hum because the fixed nature most of these panels, which are riveted on to meet this price point, so you can't even unscrew it. Now, I will say I am quite spoiled by cases like the end cases where you can pretty much build the case around the components or remove all the panels when needed. But to fit an M.2 board into this exacting of a space, that's almost what you need in order to make it a tolerable experience. The case does have some flexibility as far as power supply choice goes, but the position is very inflexible with both SFX and ATX. And I would have wanted the option to place it flat next to the board if I had the space by going with mini-itx, or push it up the front or move it down or up, whatever, right? There's room to do so, but it's frustrating that you can't. And building with an ITX board at this point doesn't give you a whole lot of space savings either because of that, because you can't move the board down and to get some headroom here. It's just a very rigid building case in that regard. Now, building with a 360, I mentioned, it was a fun aspiration when I first saw the case, but after actually doing it, it was not an experience that I would care to repeat. And as mentioned, you can get more breathable rad surface area with a 280. So that's kind of just one of those things that sounds really, really sexy on paper, but perhaps that's not such a big deal. Just don't do it right. But then so much of the dimensions and the volume of this case is dedicated to being able to do that. And as mentioned, I feel like the thermal performance of the case in that side radiator configuration ends up being quite suboptimal. So if you want to do build, I think the air-cooled setup is going to be where things are a little bit better. But then if this is all of a sudden an air cooler's case, then there are plenty of other cases that can do that very well too with smaller volume. It's nice that they include the fans at the top, and I'm not complaining that they do, but they really do need some kind of fan grill or a little bit more spacing. And I know that extra cost would just push up the cost of the case if they were to throw in fan grills. Can we excuse all of this because it's $70 to $75? Am I being too harsh on it? So taking a step back, and I agonized for a while on this, my conclusion ended up being no. And there's a few reasons that led me to that conclusion, because for roughly the same price, you can get Lian Li's A3 M.2 which in my opinion is a vastly superior case for doing a 360mm M.2 build-in. Sure, it's like 4 centimeters longer or whatever, so you have more footprint, but it's also way more forgiving for new builders. It's way more easy to build in for pretty much everyone, and you can use more modern, longer ATX power supplies. Even with a 360, you can shift that up and down as needed. You can top mount your 360, which results in better airflow. It's only like 5 extra liters, but it feels way more spacious and a very well utilized 5 liters. And part of that is because it doesn't have volume dedicated to that recess here at the back. And so because of that, it's also very easy to access things for your rear IO, also like a typical case. The A3 is also great for a tower heatsink build. On the other hand, if you don't want to do a 360 build in the B4, which as I showed you doesn't have the best thermals anyway, and you're fine with say a 280 and a mini-itx board, and I really can't believe I can still compare to it because it's so long in the tooth, but the original NR200 right now, you can get it for roughly $65 right now. And yeah, you don't get as modern of a front panel IO or immediate ATX power supply compatibility, but it is just still so easy to build in that one and access things inside. It's better placement for an ITX board, and that is a smaller, bona fide, small form factor case. There's not as much height for a tower cooled build, but if that's what you're after, cases like Deepcool's CH160 and Johnsbow's Z20 exist at good price points you can also get depending on the region that you're in. So like I said, don't get me wrong, I actually don't dislike the case. I just think it ended up being ideal for a very small subset of users. It's almost like the case is the camel, you know, a horse designed by a committee. They wanted to take the case to, to fit an M.2 board, check. Fit a 360mm radiator, check, it fits in here. Be able to switch between horizontal and vertical modes, check. Minimize the volume beneath that of the A3 M.2, check. Make it budget friendly, check. But in the course of being too many things to what I think are too many users, which are fringe cases, some of them, it actually ended up with a case that feels like it's got backed up into a corner. So instead of a case that's great for everything, it ends up feeling more like a case ideal for a budget-minded builder looking to do a vertical M.2 build, and someone who may be attracted to this as being able to take a 360. And in fact, if that's what you want to do, that's where this case can actually shine, and actually it makes sense if that is your primary goal. I do think this would have been better served if they just said, hey, let's stick to making this a purpose-driven 360mm vertical specialist in that 21 to 22 liter range. Make no compromises on the radiator's airflow, and then I'll also do a different version that was that's dedicated to the horizontal mode. Make that an 18 to 19 liter SFF case to fill this gap in their lineup, because Lian Li doesn't currently have a traditional layout SFF case, right? And I think that two-pronged approach may have been a more sensible one. So yeah, that's my main thoughts on this case. Thanks for watching and listening if you got this far. I know some of you are hoping that this would be a little bit more cosmopolitan. I think it tries to be, but kind of falls short in that regard. So I hope you find that information helpful. I will have links down below for everything. Go ahead and hit that like button. Make sure you're subscribed, and I'll see you in the next one.